was primarily an initiative from the seed industry. Back in the 50s, they invited European governments to together establish some basic principles on plant variety protection. And there was a follow-up conference early in the 60s, and it was in 1961, so exactly 60 years from today, when UPOV, International Convention for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants, was negotiated and adopted by 6 countries from Western Europe. So I think it's already important to note that the members of UPOV was quite limited, not only at the beginning, but for the first 30 years. The act was then revised by these very few members in 72, 78, and 91. 91, UPOV had 20 members. After 30 years, only 20 members, 19 coming from industrialized countries and South Africa. And they negotiated then this new act, which in 1998 has been ratified by 5 countries. Important to note that UPOV greatly expanded plant breeders' rights at the expense of farmers' rights. I come back to this in a second. When UPOV 91 was entered into force, no country was allowed anymore to ratify the Act of 1978. And today, and since 1998, before becoming a new member, the respective plant variety protection law is examined by the UPOV Council. Then a lot of things changed when the WTO and especially the TRIPS agreement came into force in 1994. Because in the TRIPS agreement, Article 27.3b clearly states that you need to protect plant varieties. Could be with patents or with the sui generis system, which is plant variety protection. Important to note, UPOV is not mentioned, so everybody was free to have their own law, as it was done by India, Ethiopia, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and many others. But a lot of countries rushed to ratify 1978 because they knew in few years, 1990, the Act of 91 will come into force, and then we will not be able to sign anymore this act. So they rushed into this Act of 1978, especially countries from Latin America, before the doors were closed. And they did so because they knew they have better possibilities, more flexibilities to protect farmers' rights, for example. This is the map of UPOV, in a way, how it looks today. We have just produced this map recently because if you go to the UPOV website, the whole world is red and then there is no differentiation. And we thought it's important to show that the red countries, so the countries who are bound by the UPOV Act of 91 are still predominantly in the north. In the south, there is a lot of gray, so these are non-UPOV members, and a lot of green, which are members of the Act of UPOV 78. Maybe important to note some examples. New Zealand, for example, is still UPOV 78, and they clearly stated they will stay with UPOV 78 because only on the UPOV 78 they are able to protect the indigenous rights of the Maori as they have in their contract with the Maori. Or I think it's also important to see that China is UPOV 78. China with today has the most applications for breeders' rights, although they are not member of 91. So I have spoken a lot about this difference between UPOV 78 and UPOV 91. And here for the discussion today, I'd just like you to show, I think, one of the main differences. And this is about the scope of the breeders' right. As you see in UPOV 78, which is still in force, as I said, in Latin America, New Zealand, Norway, China, and a lot of other countries, the scope of the breeder's right only covers the production for purposes of commercial marketing of propagating material. Today, it covers the production or reproduction or multiplication in any case, even if it's not for commercial marketing. This means during UPOV 78, there was no discussion about farm-safe seeds because these were out of the scope of breeders' rights. Also, the exchange between farmers has not been seen as a commercial marketing. This was out of the scope of breeders' rights. And this was the dramatic change we had with 91, really limiting the possibilities of farmers to save, exchange, and in a limited way, even sell protected seeds. Then in the Act of 91, because the scope was defined so broadly, they also introduced some exceptions, which are not here, some of them, but not the same way in the older version. So today we have exceptions saying that acts done privately and for non-commercial purposes is not covered, so you are free to do so, even for protected varieties. The same is the case for acts done for experimental purposes, and certainly very important, acts done for the purpose of breeding other varieties. So if you take a protected variety, you are doing some crossing with other varieties, you are out of the scope, you don't have to ask, you don't have to pay. This is the big difference to patents. But important to note, you are maybe out of this scope when you are doing crossing. But if you are doing mass selection, if you adapt a variety or a population, or no, let's a protected variety, if you resow, if you select some seeds for the next season, this is not out of the scope. This is seen as an essentially derived variety. And here you would need the okay from the breeder. Then they have also implemented a so-called farmer's privilege. As you just heard, this was in a kind necessary because they limited the possibilities of farmers to use protected seeds. As you see here, this is only an optional exception. So every UPOV member would be free to have a PVP law in place without these exceptions. But so far as I know, all countries have a kind of farmer's privilege installed. So what does it mean? It gives the possibility in a way to have, I would say, farm-safe seeds, but only in a very limited manner. If, for example, here it's written, you are allowed to have farm-safe seeds, but only for the product of the harvest. So if the product of the harvest is used to resow in the next season, this means everywhere where your plant is reproduced, but not using the product of the harvest, so example for trees or for berries or for the most vegetables, this is excluded. So there is no farmer's privilege for fruits, berries, and most vegetables. There is something where you use the product of the harvest, for example, for wheat or for potatoes. And then there is written that it's only allowed to have this farmer's privilege with reasonable limits and subject to the safeguarding of the legitimate interest of the breeder. This means, and how it is implemented in a lot of countries, that if you are, as a farmer, above a certain quantity, even if you have grown the seeds in your fields, you need to pay royalties. And it's restricted always. you could only use the farm-safe seeds in your own holding. So this means also exchange and sale is prohibited in principle. So this means it's a very limited privilege, only for certain crops, only for a limited amount, and any exchange and sale is prohibited. So as we've seen, this is in a deep contrast to the rights of farmers as it is enshrined, for example, in the international treaty. The international treaty says clearly the farmers have a right, and this right is recognized in this treaty, to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-safe seeds, and that these rights are fundamental for the realization of farmers' rights. And these rights are here because there is a recognition of this enormous contribution made by farmers for the conservation and the development of plant genetic resources, and that this constitutes the basis of our food. So this is not given just out of the blue. These rights are given because it was recognized that they are crucial for global food security. Then there is another article, 9.3, which then in a way says that nothing here should be interpreted to limit any rights that farmers have to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-safe seed, subject to national law and as appropriate. As you see, it's a negotiated text. There has to be back and forth and a lot of negotiations. And so this is a kind of limitation. But this limitation does not exist in the UN declaration, which was adopted a little bit later in 2018, because here it's clearly said farmers' rights include the right to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-safe seeds, and that states shall take appropriate measures to support the peasant seed system. I think it's important to see also the link here. It's in a way implicitly said that these rights to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-safe seeds is also a fundamental pillar of the peasant seed system. And I think a very important, useful clause in this Article 19 of UNDROP is that they also request the states that when drafting plant variety protection laws, they need to respect and take into account exactly these rights as mentioned, for example, in Article 19. So when we speak about the impact of this UPOV and plant variety protection limiting these rights, I think it's central to see the need we have to save the farmer seed system, because there is consensus, I think, all over the world. The farmer seed system is by far the most important source of seed in most farming systems in the world. It's still today a given. There are certainly differences between crops, but still in a lot of developing countries, it's by far the most important system to give access to seeds. And there is another study published by Coombs in 2015, and they say that the farmer seed network make a vital contribution to agriculture because they draw material from the wilds and from improved varieties, redirecting gene flow and enabling farmers to reshape by cultivation and further seed transfer crop populations. I think it's interesting to see that here they explicitly also made the link that also the use of improved varieties and integrating them into the farmer managed seed system creates more biodiversity. As it is said here, there's a study from the US Department of Agriculture. They explicitly say that these genetic resources are the basis from which all the crop production stems, but habitat loss and the dominance of scientifically bred over farmer-developed varieties and genetic uniformity are all threats to continued diversity. But plant breeders need diverse germplasm to sustain productivity growth. So we see even what we would call industrialized breeders, they need this diversity, and they, in a way, dependent, if you like to say, from the diversity created through the farmer-managed seed system. And maybe finally, it's also important really for people living in the global south. It's a study here I mentioned by the European Parliament, which clearly says that UPOV 91, these far-reaching IP standards, has generally a negative effect in terms of poverty reduction. And I was the part of a study, a so-called human rights impact assessment, which I mentioned at the bottom, where the conclusion was that this UPOV 91 limits really farmers' capacity to access seeds through informal channels, because the exchange, the sell on the local market was not possible anymore. And UPOV 91 could also limit the sale of seeds by farmers as an important source of income, which is also essential for the diffusion of seeds in the informal system. Just shortly, this is a study for the World Bank done by Wageningen University. They say farmer seed system are the main source of seed. IPR may reduce the effectiveness of this system by limiting the saving, exchanging, and selling of farm-produced seed-protected varieties. So it's quite obvious that there is a negative effect on the, I would say, the most important seed system we have today to feed our world and to create agrobiodiversity every day. These two systems, if we speak about the formal and the here called informal, I would call it the farmer-managed seed system, is here in these two circles. The one circle is outside, this is the formal sector, and there is another circle inside the farmer-managed seed system. And for our discussion today, it's important about these arrows. We see here the arrow on the top left, top right, the pointed arrow, which clearly indicates that the formal seed sector has this access to the farmer-managed seed system. This today is regulated, for example, by the multilateral system of the international treaty. And as we know, in general, there are no payments. You sign the SMTA, but you use all the seeds in an easy access and for free. And then there's the other arrow on the right, on the bottom, which says that also the farmer-managed seed system may access seeds, varieties coming from the farmers, from the formal seed system, for example, also from national research organizations. And this arrow between here, the formal and the informal, is regulated, for example, by plant variety protection laws. And if we have today plant variety protection laws in place, which do not allow the further exchange, farm-safe use, and selling, this arrow does not work, because in this case, the seeds are not available for this system, because the system needs to have the possibility to freely exchange and sell and save the seeds. This means today we have a regulation in place which protects the formal system, and I would say the innovation by the formal system, but at the same time, this regulation limits the innovation made by the farmer-managed seed system. So we protected one system, but at the same time, we are limiting or restricting the other one. And this is certainly a regulation we don't need. Now, all this plant variety protection is made to promote innovation, as they say, and to promote access to better seeds. And therefore, I think it's interesting to see that even for the trade of seeds, where you say UPOV is essential, the impact is not so clear. Here is a study mentioned from Eton. They have analyzed 80 importing countries about the value of the export and how it's imported then into these countries with or without PVP laws. And they see they did not find any evidence that the adoption of UPOV system provides a better influence for seed imports. So this has not shown any evidence that when you have a good protection, everybody will come to you and sell the seeds in your country. Another study we have done about Francophone Africa, where UPOV was in place for 10 years, showed that there was really, I would say, no positive effect on the breeding situation. After 10 years, in 17 countries, only 50 varieties have been protected. Most of them have already been there before 2006. And the private sector, in 10 years, in 17 countries from Western Africa, have protected 10 varieties. So there was really no positive impact through this protection. But in contrary, there has been a case where there was a misappropriation. So a farmer's variety has illegally been protected with a plant breeder's right. There has been another impact study done by UPOV themselves, where they told us, hey, in Vietnam, we had UPOV in place since 10 years. And after 10 years, for example, for sweet potato, we have 30%, so 3% per annum, a better yield. And they told us that with this 30% increased yield after 10 years, we could feed 70 million people more. We had a look on this study and we found out that in the case of sweet potato, it's true, the yield increased, but there has been zero plant breeders' rights on sweet potatoes in these 10 years. This shows clearly the biggest yield increase you had with a variety, with a crop where there was no breeder's right. So it's not easy to calculate about the impact on what if you have a new PVP law in place. In our view, we should always look what is the impact on human rights, what is the impact on access to seeds for farmers, on agrobiodiversity, food security, and so on. But often only the number of varieties protected are analyzed when the impact is analyzed of a new plant variety protection law. So certainly we have to know all these impacts I told you just now. It's not only from PVP law, other seed laws, including also patent laws, marketing laws, also have an impact about the functioning of the formal seed system, the functioning of the informal seed system. So we should just keep this in mind. This is not all over. This is my last slide. Thank you very much. This is a statement, a quote from the UN Secretary General made in his report in 2015. And he says, the pressures exerted on small-scale farming stemming from the provisions of UPOV 91, the restrictions on seed management can lead to a loss of biodiversity and in turn harm the livelihoods of small-scale farmers. The restriction imposed by the Act on the use of farm-safe seeds and the prohibitions on their exchange and sale cause considerable concern. And I only could underline what the UN Secretary General is saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois.